Greetings, everyone. My name is Daniel Burston, and before I begin today, I'd like to thank Frank Stanish for inviting me to participate in this conference. I'm honored by the invitation, Frank, not least because you are one of the few Canadian academics who actually remembers Stern and takes a lively interest in his life and work. At the moment, I'm speaking to you from the Simon Silverman Phenomenology Center in the Gumberg Library at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. The Silverman Center is the home to the Stern Archive, the Karl Stern Archive, and we curate his unpublished correspondence, his rough drafts, notebooks, photographs, and memorabilia here. The archive was created with a generous donation by Stern's daughter, Catherine Skorzuska, and was open to the public on October 10th of 2014. Now, as many of you already know, Stern was born in Cham, Bavaria in 1906. He was the eldest son of assimilated Jewish parents. And between 1927 and 1937, Stern trained in medicine, neurology, and psychiatry in Munich, Frankfurt, Berlin, and London, eventually moving to Montreal, Canada in 1939. Between 1930 and 1931, Stern worked alongside Kurt Goldstein as a resident in psychiatry at the Frankfurt Neurological Institute. And in 1932, he followed Goldstein to the Department of Neurology at the Moabit Hospital in Berlin, performing brain autopsies on deceased mental patients. In the summer of 1932, Stern went to Munich for postdoctoral work at the German Research Institute for Psychiatry, where the chief of neurology, Professor Walter Spielmeyer, took him on as his assistant. As Frank Stanish points out, in 1931, Stern was already at the top of his field, and whilst visiting Canada at around that time, in the early 1930s, Spielmeyer familiarized his Canadian colleague, Wilder Penfield, with Stern's research in progress. Penfield, in turn, would help to launch Stern's career in Canada some years later. After Spielmeyer's death in December of 1934, Stern booked passage to London, where he found a position at the Neurological Institute in Queen's Square. Though he was plagued by worry and grief about the fate of friends and family he'd left behind, Stern flourished professionally, and while there he married Lieselotte von Baer, the sister of his good friend Erich von Baer. Stern and his wife arrived in Montreal on June 24th, 1939, and Stern went to work at the Hôpital de Notre-Dame and somewhat later at the Verdun Protestant Hospital. Soon after his arrival, Stern befriended another émigré neuroscientist by the name of Miguel Prados. Prados was from Spain originally and had collaborated with Santiago Ramón y Cajal in a famous study on the corpus callosum that was published in 1922. Prados was also an ardent Republican who'd fled Franco's Spain and who shared Stern's anti-fascist sensibilities. Like Stern, Prados was also deeply interested in psychoanalysis, and as a result, perhaps, the two of them became close friends, co-authoring numerous papers together over the years. Another émigré neurologist whom Stern befriended at this time, or shortly thereafter, was Hines Layman, who became the chief of psychiatry at the Douglas Hospital in Montreal. Layman arrived in Montreal in 1937, a few years before Stern, but like Stern, converted from Judaism to Christianity. Though he's chiefly remembered nowadays for introducing the use of chlorpromazine in the treatment of schizophrenia and for advocating the decriminalization of marijuana and of homosexuality in the 1960s. In any case, getting back to our earlier concerns, in 1943, Penfield recommended Stern to Ewan Cameron, the chief of psychiatry at McGill University, who placed Stern in charge of McGill's geriatric psychiatry unit, the first in Canada, I believe. By 1951, 1 year prior to his departure from McGill, Stern had authored 52 articles on neuroanatomy, neuropathology, and several psychiatric disorders in prestigious medical journals in both English and German. That same year, 1951, Stern published his first book, a memoir entitled The Pillar of Fire. The Pillar of Fire became an international bestseller and was greeted by many Catholics as a worthy successor to other conversion narratives like those of Dorothy Day, her book From Union Square to Rome, which was published in 1937, and the better-known book by Thomas Merton, The Seven-Story Mountain, which was published in 1948. The Pillar of Fire was translated into German, French, Spanish, Dutch, and Italian. And as a result, by the mid-1960s, Stern was a well-known public figure, a public intellectual in Canada and the United States. He was a member of the writers' organization PEN and a Canadian representative to the UNESCO Institute of Education. In 1965, Stern testified as an expert on racism and prejudice in the Canadian House of Commons and appeared frequently during the 60s on CBC radio and television, and was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Laval in 1968. Now, quite apart from its appeal to Catholics, The Pillar of Fire gives us a very vivid description of Stern's experience as an émigré living in London and Montreal. His account of arriving in London is masterful, and it conveys the sense of alienation that enveloped him and his contemporaries on all sides. For example, he wrote, quote, "We settled imperceptibly like dust in the huge cities of the Western world. Then there were corners where the dust tended to collect and in which it was easily seen. There were streets full of us, Greencroft Gardens in London Northwest, Washington Heights in New York City. Many, however, settled like dispersed particles in Paddington, Ealing, or Hendon. Each of us carried an invisible wall of strangeness around him because those summer evenings of our childhood in Königstein or in Starnberg were incommunicable to others." Close quote. Now, if Stern's fellow refugees felt like dust particles blown willy-nilly by prevailing winds, their neighbors experienced them not as forlorn individuals or as particles, but as what Stern described as the penetrating anonymity of the city, like a fog. So these are the two metaphors that Stern used, dust and fog, to describe the experience of émigré populations, both their own experience and the way they're experienced by others. And they're both very apt metaphors when you think about it. After all, both dust and fog consist of tiny, insubstantial particles. They have no permanent residence. They do not travel of their own volition at the time or the destination of their own choosing. They're also nuisances and potential hazards if they're thick enough, not the sort of thing that one welcomes into one's home or on the neighborhood streets. Meanwhile, Stern and his contemporaries were dependent on the beneficence of a new host country, the United Kingdom. And in circumstances like these, said Stern, quote, "Generosity was no mother. It was a nurse with the odor of antisepsis." Meanwhile, the joy of freedom, such as it was blighted by the émigrés' frequent inability to help loved ones to safety in the face of bureaucratic indifference and overwhelming odds. Now, in an effort to overcome the crushing sense of anonymity and helplessness that he and his contemporaries experienced, Stern said that many émigrés tried to master the English language as often as quickly as possible. In so doing, said Stern, their whole relationship to language was altered. For better and worse, Moses Mendelssohn had persuaded several generations that German was the true language of Jewish emancipation and urged Jews to embrace the language of Herder, Lessing, Humboldt, Goethe, and Kant. But now, for these men, their native language, once a source of pride, of comfort, and delight, became the language of the enemy, with capital E, associated even in their own minds with, and I quote, "that thing behind us, that monstrous anti-mother, that dark and demonic crater from which we had come." So it doesn't require great imagination to see that the journey taken in flight from a monstrous anti-mother into the arms of an antiseptic nurse couldn't have been much fun for anyone. But Stern was luckier than most, and he knew it too. Though plagued by worry about friends and family, Stern flourished in London, partly because his newfound work environment was more congenial to him than the ones he'd left behind. As he later recalled, he admired that mixture of, I quote, sobriety and pragmatism, dryness and brilliant lucidity, so characteristic of Anglo-Saxon science. He also delighted in the English fondness for eccentricity, for unusual and self-taught men. And while acknowledging what he called the invisible walls that surrounded members of different social classes, Stern was deeply impressed with the sense of solidarity between them, especially in the face of adversity and a common foe. Even in the absence of a common faith or political ideology to unite them, said Stern, communal rituals like tea and choral singing pervaded his workplace, imparting a sense of civility and belonging quite unlike the rigid hierarchies that he'd experienced in Frankfurt, Munich, and Berlin. Montreal was a different matter. As Stern recalled, his wife and he were quite demoralized on arrival by what he described as, quote, the monotonous infinity of houses. The houses were jerry-built, row after row, creeping like fungi, mass-cultured by wealthy people who lived in cool stone buildings far, far away from us. The houses were filled with settees and moonlit lake scenes with moose, mahogany radios, Jesus the Good Shepherd, and so on. With insignificant variations, the same uniformity prevailed on all sides. Thoughts were channeled into all this by radio and newspapers, as if an ocean were being artificially aerated. It was as though the mystery of human existence itself had been replaced with a prefabricated life. Prefabricated is capitalized, life is capitalized. The Sterns' discomfort with their new environment was compounded by another, more immediate and pressing problem: poverty. For many months after their arrival, half of Stern's salary went to support his parents, who were still in London. Another disquieting factor for Stern and his wife was the tension between Montreal's ethnic enclaves. This was not chiefly a matter of social class, but of language and of faith. The Francophone population, noted Stern, possessed a rural village mentality not unlike early 18th century France. Even city-dwelling Francophones were unusually pious, traditional, and therefore wary, if not actually contemptuous, of finance and industrialization, and by implication, of the English and the Scots, and of course, the Jews. By contrast, Montreal's Anglophone population were far more modern and successful, but they were disdainful of their French neighbors and towards the Irish, who also settled in Montreal in large numbers. So, far from being the cosmopolitan city that it is today, Montreal, as Stern experienced it in the late 1930s and early 1940s, was a city of insular enclaves that merely reproduced and perpetuated all the old rivalries and antagonisms of Europe on a miniature scale. In addition to resentments they brought from their ancestral homes, Stern found that contemporaneous developments in Europe were intensifying Montreal's ethnic divides. Montreal's large Jewish population was openly and emphatically anti-fascist, and therefore supportive of the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. By contrast, many Catholics in Quebec were rooting for Franco, Generalissimo Franco, and were openly anti-Semitic. So pause for a moment to consider Stern's predicament. He was nominally Jewish, but married to a German-speaking Protestant. And this state of affairs already rendered smooth integration into either the Jewish or the Anglophone communities in Montreal extremely complicated. Worse yet, as the world slid into war, he was moving slowly but steadily towards conversion to Catholicism, though unlike most Catholics, he was deeply opposed to Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler. Considering the mood of the city then, it's no surprise that after many months in Canada, the Sterns still had no feeling of belonging. On the contrary, he said in a colorful turn of phrase, they felt, I quote, like rabbits who turned up accidentally in the middle of a fox hunt, close quote. Another source of insight into Stern's émigré experience is his novel, Through Dooms of Love, which was published in 1961. Set in Chicago in 1949, the novel pivots around the life and vicissitudes of Leonard and Marianne Radbert, father and daughter, who emigrated from Czechoslovakia via London a decade previously. Leonard sprang from the lesser nobility, had one Jewish parent, and was therefore considered Jewish under Nazi law. And so the family was stripped of its fortune, very much as Lieselot von Bayer's family was, albeit in fact, not in fiction. At any rate, thanks to Marianne Radbert, who became a fashion model, Leonard, her father, was never destitute. But neither could Leonard ever fully either connect with or adapt to American culture. And when he was hospitalized after a debilitating stroke, he was more deeply disoriented than the average stroke patient. Leonard Radbert's inexorable decline led Marianne to seek psychotherapy from Dr. Joseph Bernstam, a member of the hospital staff, who was a deeply traumatized Holocaust survivor, who also had deep interests in philosophy, literature, metaphysics, not unlike Stern himself. But Bernstam is a tragic figure who, at the end of the day, is no better suited to his American surroundings than Marianne's father was. We lack the time for a more detailed analysis of the novel's plot, which is the subject of my next article, entitled The Politics of Psychiatry and the Vicissitudes of Faith, circa 1950, subtitled Karl Stern's Psychiatric Novel, an article which appears in the forthcoming issue of the Journal of the History of Behavioral Sciences. Suffice it to say that the cultural challenges that these three transplanted Europeans faced, individually and together, comprised much of the novel's content. While Stern was a celebrated public intellectual, I became interested in his experience as an émigré somewhat belatedly, having first been attempted to understand his dogged efforts to reconcile psychoanalysis with Catholic theology and existential phenomenology, and to critique anti-Semitism in the Catholic Church, which was his other main passion. After all, if you think about it, how does one reconcile the ideas of a militant atheist and materialist like Freud with Catholicism? And why embrace a faith whose adherents are mostly disparaging, if not actually hateful, towards members of one's ancestral faith? And were these efforts successful? The short answer is yes and no, but deeper reflections along these lines are not relevant here. More relevant, I suspect, was Stern's claim that the human brain is vivid proof of the existence of God, an attitude he shared, I believe, with Sir John Eccles and perhaps a handful of other neurologists in that era. How many? I can't say. But I suspect that this belief differentiated him from the vast majority of his colleagues. In any case, for those who can make the journey here, the Stern Archive has plenty of material of interest to historians whose primary concerns are with his career as a neurologist and his life as an émigré in London and Montreal. And anyone who cares to visit may contact me at burston@duq.edu. Burston is spelled B-U-R-S-T-O-N @duq.edu. Or if you wish to contact the archivist directly, his name is Dr. Thomas White, and he can be reached at whitet, one word, whitet @duq.edu. Finally, friends, I'd like to call your attention to a display case that we have in the Silverman Center, containing mostly letters and awards that Stern received. This is a medallion for the Cardinal Newman Award, another for the Christopher Award, and letters here from Reinhold Niebuhr, C.S. Lewis, Carl Jung, Dorothy Day, Graham Greene, Thomas Merton, and Sigmund Freud. Beside this case, we have another containing mostly photographs. They're mostly small snapshots and mostly undated, but they're a good photographic record of his infancy, childhood, less so about his adolescence, but certainly of his professional career, various stages, London, Montreal, and so on. Also a few family photos. My favorite here, at the very bottom, is a picture of Karl and his wife on vacation at Lake Memphremagog, a favorite vacation spot outside of Montreal in the eastern townships. Thank you once again for inviting me to participate in this conference. All the best.